They buried my mother without telling me, and they used my money to do it. My name is Marin Calloway, 34, public hospital social worker, borrower of library books, baker of thrift store pies. I live in a narrow apartment near the river, where the streetcar rattles the window glass and the kettle sings louder than the traffic. On the morning I learned my mother's funeral had already happened, a pale band of November light cut across my kitchen floor. Dust turned in it slowly, like ash that had changed its mind. The news came from a cousin's accidental post, a framed photo of carnations and a closed casket, captioned with 2 doves. My mother's name, Ruth Calloway, sat beneath a date that had passed 2 days before. I blinked at the screen. My tea went cold. The next breath hurt in my ribs, the way a stitch steals into your side when you run too far without warning. We were not a gentle family. My older sister, Caroline, learned early how to divide a room with one raised eyebrow. My aunt, Eleanor, turned hurt into currency, counting every favor owed and charging interest. When I left for college on a scholarship none of them expected me to earn, they called it abandonment. When I came back after the divorce, they called it failure. Every gathering after that grew careful around me, as if my presence might tarnish the silver. Still, I visited my mother every Sunday, carrying lemon bars and the library's large print mysteries. She'd touch the lemon sugar with a fingertip and smile like a girl who had come back from recess. She'd ask about my clients, listen for good news, then remind me that bad weather does not last forever. It was the only sermon she ever believed. Her last month was a slow tightening. The messages from Caroline grew curt, updates sent without tenderness. When I texted about visiting, the replies took longer, then stopped. Mom needs rest, Caroline wrote once, and followed it with a period that felt like a slammed door. I was working the late shift when the hospital called to say my mother had taken a turn. I missed the call by 7 minutes. By the time I reached the hospice ward, the nurse I knew took my hand and shook her head. I sat by my mother's bed for an hour anyway, tracing the soft valleys of the sheets, the hollow where her hand had been. I whispered the first lines of the mystery we never finished, and when I stood to leave, I promised her I would help with arrangements. I would make them right. 3 days later, I was in my kitchen with the kettle, the light, the dust, and the phone in my hand, staring at a funeral I had not attended. The photo was crowded with family. Caroline stood near the casket, slim and composed in black, her chin tilted in practiced sorrow. My aunt held a tissue like a prop. Someone had placed my mother's blue shawl at the foot of the arrangement, the one I had bought her last winter, weaving the last of my Christmas budget into something warmer than cash. I felt a silence open behind my sternum, a new room carved from grief. I did not cry. I did not call. I set my phone face down, the cousin's doves trapped beneath my palm, and listened to the kettle hiss out the last of its anger. Then the other sound arrived, a soft buzz against the counter. My bank app, alerting me of a completed transfer, the sizable one I had made the day after Mom died, a contribution for the service Caroline had promised we would plan together. I had sent it to my aunt's account, per their instructions, to simplify logistics. The alert chimed again, a line item from a funeral home on the eastern edge of the city, dated and stamped. I lifted the phone. The room stayed very still. In the quiet, something shifted. It was not rage. It was not even surprise. It was the first small spark of understanding, reached with the same careful hands I used to open the hospital medication cabinet. They had excluded me, but they had not refused my money. The terms were clear. I was good enough to pay, not good enough to grieve. I poured my tea and held the cup to my cheek, letting the heat steady me. A single thought rose, clean and plain. If you will not offer me a chair, I will build my own table. Grief makes time elastic. The next week stretched like taffy, pulled thin in places, and snapped abruptly in others. My phone filled with messages that mistook me for a quiet weather pattern. You were traveling, right? One cousin asked, as if distance could excuse absence. A neighbor left sympathy flowers, but did not ring the bell. At work I signed forms, made calls, wrote notes for families whose emergencies were louder than mine. I cleaned a playroom between visits and found a single marble, blue and veined, hiding under the radiator. I turned it in my palm until the metal left a faint crescent mark on my skin. At night, the apartment pressed close. I took the blue shawl from its place on my chair and draped it over my shoulders, then saw the funeral photo again, the shawl folded near the flowers like a surrendered flag. When had they taken it from my mother's house? Who had remembered the small moth-eaten corner and tucked it under, dignified but tidy? These were not questions that could be answered. They were ashes that refused to cool. Caroline did not call. She sent one text, a neat paragraph. It all happened quickly. We handled everything. It was best to keep things simple. Hope you understand. I read it twice. I responded once. I would have come, I wrote. A message showed the typing dots, then disappeared. She never replied. I had helped other people stand up after worse. There were fathers who never came back, houses that sagged after fires, teenagers who made choices with consequences we could only soften, not erase. I knew the advice I gave them, delivered in calm phrases that did not insult their pain. Find a small thing you can do. Do it. Then find the next small thing. So, I made a list on the back of an envelope. Cancel the newspaper at Mom's house. Pick up her reading glasses from the hospice lost and found. Call the bank to close her ATM card. Each line, when crossed, sounded like a small, stiff page turning. I did these things with my coat on, and my head clear, and my heart wrapped in plain brown paper. The bank transfer alert waited in the app, 48 hours old and glowing with the efficiency that tries to pass for kindness. I opened it. The receipt showed a wire in my name from my account to an account under my aunt's initials. The memo line read, "For Mom service per C." There was an invoice attached from a funeral home I didn't recognize, its logo a set of overreaching laurels. The total was divided into packages and fees. A typed note at the bottom thanked the family for choosing them at a difficult time. At the hospital, I teach families to keep every document. Paper is how systems respect grief, or at least how they see it. I saved the receipt to a folder with my mother's name. Then I printed 2 copies, folded them once, and slid them into a manila envelope. I did not know why I needed hard paper. I only knew that ink on a page feels more difficult to deny. On Thursday, while I waited for the bus, Mrs. Alvarez from 4B found me on the bench and sat down with a sigh that carried 20 grocery bags. She had known my mother, sharing recipes and herb cuttings over the back fence when I was small. She studied my face the way women who have survived hard years read the weather through a kitchen window. "I didn't see you at the funeral," she said gently. "They didn't tell me," I said. She touched my wrist. "Some people cannot see the person holding the roof up," she said. "They only see who stands in the doorway." I smiled, small and real. "I sent the money," I said, and my voice did not shake. "They used it, but they didn't tell me when or where to go." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, as if she had already guessed. "Mija, sometimes your quiet is mistaken for permission," she said. "If you want them to see you, show them a truth too heavy to ignore." That night, I lit a candle on the windowsill, the cheap white kind that comes in a glass cylinder. I set my mother's library card beside it, and a tiny bottle of her favorite hand lotion, the lavender one with a silver cap. I said her name out loud once, as if I were threading it through a needle. Before I slept, I opened the family group thread, a long history of holiday plans and recipes and passive complaints. I scrolled through messages from the last 10 days, measuring the silence they had given me. Then I closed it. Not yet, I thought. The difference between noise and testimony is timing. I would not fling my hurt like a plate. I would set it down where it could not be swept under the rug. I turned the candle off with a quick breath and made a plan. It tasted like metal and mercy. It would not be loud. It would be exact. 2 doors opened at once the next morning. The first was literal. The bank branch near the hospital, a warm square of light in the gray. The second was the memory of my mother teaching me how to reconcile a checkbook at the kitchen table, her pencil tapping the margin, her voice patient. "If you can prove it on paper, you won't need to prove it with arguments," she had said. I carried that line with me like a clean handkerchief. Inside the bank, I asked to speak to someone about a transfer confirmation. They offered a chair and a polite man with a tie the color of deep water. "I'm Arjun," he said, and waited with the respectful stillness of a good listener. I explained that there had been a family death, that I had sent funds, and that I needed a formal statement for my records. I left out the part about the funeral I did not attend, because the story could stand without it. Arjun printed a detailed receipt, stamped it with a blue seal, and slid it across the desk. "This shows the amount, the date, and the recipient account," he said. "We can also include the memo line and the invoice you attached." He glanced at the invoice, then back at me. "I'm sorry for your loss," he added, and the gentleness in his tone made room for breath I did not realize I had been holding. "Thank you," I said. "May I also have a letter stating that the transfer could not be reversed, that it was complete before the funeral date listed?" "Of course," he said and typed. The printer warmed and sang. He stamped the letter too, then placed both documents into a crisp envelope with the bank's emblem. This was paper that systems respected. Before I left, I made one more request. "Would you mind printing the balance snapshot from that morning?" I asked, "so the timeline is unmistakable." He nodded, understanding more than I had said, and added the page to the envelope. When I stood to go, he paused. "Sometimes families look for a story that makes the math feel kinder," he said. "The numbers don't bend. Be kind to yourself, even when others are not." On my way out, I texted Jonah, a nurse from my floor with shoulders like a dock and a voice like a clarinet. He had helped me call the hospice the night my mother died, standing near the phone in quiet solidarity. "We have never dated, which is exactly why I trust him." He answered immediately. "Lobby in 10, he wrote. I waited on a bench by the coffee kiosk, the bank envelope on my lap like a small shield. He arrived with 2 paper cups, and his eyebrows lifted in a question. I explained in the same calm tone I used with families who needed to understand what paperwork could and could not fix. I showed him the receipt. I showed him the letter and the stamps and the memo line. He read in silence, then passed the papers back. "That's clean," he said. "You're not waving a torch. You're turning on a light." "I don't want to fight," I said. "I want the truth to stand where everyone can see it, and I want it to be simple." He nodded. "How will you do it?" "Quietly," I said. "I'll submit the documents to the funeral home's file so they can't be erased from the record. I'll ask the hospice to include a copy in Mom's chart. Then I'll send a single message to the family thread with the receipt and one sentence. No barbs. No commentary." Jonas smoothed the paper coffee sleeve as if straightening a tie. "And if they lash out?" "I won't," I said. "I'll let the documents do the job." He smiled a little. "That is the most Marin thing I've ever heard." After lunch, I stopped at the funeral home listed on the invoice. The lobby was scented with something that wanted to be comfort and landed too sweet. A young director with careful hair met me at the desk. I introduced myself, named my mother, and offered the envelope. "These are for your records," I said. They confirmed the source of payment. He studied the seal and the letter. His professionalism flickered, then steadied. "Thank you," he said. "We'll place this with the file." "One more thing," I said. "Please add this memorial line to the printed program if you reissue for the digital archive." I handed him a 4x6 card with my mother's favorite line from a poem she loved. He read it and nodded. "We can do that." I walked out into the thin sunlight feeling as if I had set a cornerstone. The structure would hold. By the time I reached the bus stop, my phone buzzed with a reply from the hospice administrator confirming they would add my documents to the chart. The truth had an address now, filing cabinets and reference numbers. It could be found. At home, I placed the remaining copy of the receipt in a small cedar box that held my mother's wedding ring and a pressed maple leaf. I sat at the table and opened the family thread. My fingers did not tremble. The message I wrote was one line. "For clarity and the record, here is the bank transfer I sent to cover Mom's service." Then I attached the receipt, the letter with the blue stamp, and the invoice page with the date, and I pressed send. The thread bloomed messages like a sudden storm. The first came from Caroline, sharp and tidy. "This is inappropriate," she wrote. "Money is not the point." Aunt Eleanor followed quickly. "We handled what needed handling," she said. "You were busy. We didn't want to burden you." I put the phone face down and folded a dish towel in half, then in half again, smoothing the corners until they met. When I lifted the screen, the dots were blinking. My cousin added a string of heart emojis and a vague apology. An uncle, silent for years, weighed in with a lecture about respect. The chorus swelled. It was loud but not precise, like a radio between stations. I waited. I reminded myself that silence is not surrender when it is chosen. Then I wrote 3 short sentences, each one a clean beam in a bare room. Money is not the point, I typed. But transparency is kind. I was not informed of the funeral. I would have come. I attached nothing this time. I did not ask for answers. I did not present a bill. I sent the message and turned off notifications. Then I put on my coat and walked to my mother's house. The November air tasted of iron. Leaves skated against the curb. The small bungalow felt emptied but not vacant, like a woman who has stepped into another room to change and will return any minute. I unlocked the door with the spare key I had never relinquished and crossed the foyer where we had lined up our shoes as children. On the mantel, the photo of my mother in her nursing school uniform watched the door with patient eyes. I lit the gas heater and sat at the dining table, where a circle of sunlight warmed the wood. This was where my mother wrote checks in careful script, adding the extra line of sense as if music demanded it. It was where she placed our report cards and our birthday cards, and the recipe clippings she never tried because she preferred the old ones. I set my manila envelope on the table and waited. Caroline arrived first, all angles in a dark coat, hair pinned so tight it supposed control. She did not sit. "This is ugly," she said. "You're making this ugly." I looked at the receipt peeking from the envelope and then at her face. "No," I said. "I am making it clear." Aunt Eleanor came in after, rustling like tissue. She arranged her mouth into a broken-hearted bow. "We thought you were overwhelmed," she said. "We spared you." "You spared yourselves my presence," I said. "You did not spare my bank account." Her cheeks flushed. "We were going to thank you," she said. "You did," I said, and slid the printed invoice toward her. With my name removed, the room held us in a tight triangle. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a passing siren etched a brief blue line along the ceiling. Caroline finally sat, as if grabbing a lower branch to steady herself. "Mom was confused at the end," she said, and her voice tried for compassion but leaned toward credential. "She told me things that contradicted themselves." "Maybe," I said. "Dying is confusing work." I folded my hands. She also told me to make the service gentle. She wanted carnations and her blue shawl. She wanted the poem. I met Caroline's eyes. "You did none of those without me, and yet you used what I sent, on time, in good faith." Caroline's mouth tightened, then softened a fraction. Aunt Eleanor stirred, looking for the path that had always lifted her above consequence. She did not find it. "I want nothing from you," I said. "No payback. No apology I have to grade for sincerity. I will not send another message after this. The documents are in the funeral home's file and the hospice chart. The bank letter is clear. The truth exists outside our opinions." Caroline stared at the table, not at me. "What do you want then?" she asked, the smallest break in her voice finally showing. "What is this for?" "To place a chair in a room where I was meant to stand outside," I said. "To make sure that when history is told, your version is not the only one considered official." We sat in the silence that follows a clean incision, the kind that bleeds but also heals. Aunt Eleanor smoothed the invoice with 2 fingers, as if she were calming a frightened bird. "I did not mean to erase you," she said, so quiet I almost missed it. "You didn't erase me," I said. "I'm here." Footsteps sounded on the porch, and Jonah knocked softly before opening the door a careful inch. "I brought the keys for the hospice donation box," he said, holding them up. He saw our faces and paused. "I can come back." "It's fine," I said, and something in my voice made both women look at me differently, as if I had grown or perhaps just stood up straighter. I took the keys, thanked him, and he left with a promise to call later. I gathered the envelope, slid the papers inside, and stood. "I'll host a small memorial here next Sunday," I said. 3 o'clock. Tea, lemon bars, the poem. "Anyone who wants to come is welcome." Caroline looked at the radiator, as if heat could advise her. "I'll come," she said finally, almost to the room. Aunt Eleanor nodded once, relief and discomfort braided together. "Good," I said. "Bring nothing but gentleness." I turned off the heater and locked the door behind us. The street felt honest. The sky, blank as new paper, waited. On Sunday, I woke early and opened every window in my apartment, letting the cold air rinse the rooms. I mixed lemon and sugar into butter with a wooden spoon that had belonged to my mother's mother, a handle polished by 4 decades of work. The radio murmured a classical station, shy and steady. When the bar set, I carried them to my mother's house in a tin printed with winter birds. The key turned easily, as if the lock remembered my hand. I moved slowly through each room, dusting with a damp cloth, collecting the fragile things that made a place feel held. I arranged a small table in the front room with a candle, the library card, the lavender lotion, and a glass vase of inexpensive carnations. I lay the blue shawl over the chair by the window, the one that caught late afternoon sun and warmed a person's shoulders without asking. The poem sat on a stand beside the vase, short and exact, its single brave image like a hand placed over a heart. People came in ones and twos. A neighbor brought tea tins and tiny ceramic cups. 2 nurses from hospice arrived with quiet steps and eyes that had seen too much and kept their softness. Caroline came with the stiffness of a person who has promised herself to do a difficult thing well, and Aunt Eleanor followed carrying a plate of store-bought cookies that tried hard and failed to be homemade. No one mentioned the thread. No one mentioned the receipt. They did not need to. The room had chosen its weather. We sat in a loose oval. Stories began the way small streams do, uncertain at first, and then gathering volume. The hospice nurse shared how my mother thanked every aide by name. Mrs. Alvarez remembered the time my mother taught the block to make soup from whatever was left in the pantry. Jonah arrived 20 minutes in, slipping into a chair near the door, a small nod of hello. I read the poem. The line my mother loved reached gently across the hours and lay down among us like a well-behaved cat. During the tea after, Caroline stood near the dining table, holding a cup with both hands the way a person does when they are deciding whether to be brave. When she approached, her eyes were clearer than I had seen them in years. "I should have called you," she said. "I cannot explain why I didn't in a way that will sound generous. I let my idea of control stand in for care. I am sorry. There are apologies that demand a receipt and those that ask for a chair. This was the second kind." I nodded once. "Thank you," I said. "I accept." "I saw the documents," she added, her voice very low. "The dates. The stamp. I think I needed something I couldn't argue with to understand how small I was behaving." "You were grieving," I said. "So was I." For a moment we were 2 girls again in the kitchen, arguing about who would wash and who would dry, refusing to admit that folding the dish towel together made the work go faster. Caroline set her cup down. "If you want to manage Mom's library returns, I can handle the utilities," she said. It was not everything. It was enough. Later, after everyone left, I walked the house one more time. I took down the poem and placed it into the cedar box with the ring and the leaf and the receipt, these small artifacts of proof and love. I closed the lid. In the kitchen, I washed the teacups and lined them on a towel like a string of moons. Outside, evening peeled a thin band of pink along the horizon. I locked the door and turned my collar up and walked back to my apartment along the river, where the streetcar hummed and the city's pulse kept time. At home, I wrote a letter to the library requesting a memorial bookplate in my mother's name for the mystery section. I made a small automatic transfer, once a month, to fund it indefinitely. I saved the confirmation beside the bank letter. Proof could be quiet and still be warm. In the days that followed, the thread softened. A cousin sent old photos and asked for copies. Aunt Eleanor forwarded a recipe for the soup my mother loved, with a note that did not try too hard to be forgiven. Caroline texted a question about the electric bill and followed it with a line about the birds returning to the yard, as if she had remembered how to notice small good things. We were not fixed. We were functional. Sometimes that is a larger miracle. I returned to work and listened better, which is to say I listened with both ears and the part of my chest where the kettle's steam warms the cold mornings. I told a father to save every document, and when he asked why, I said, because paper remembers when people try to forget. He nodded as if I had revealed a secret, but it was only the way I had learned to survive. On the first Sunday of December, I planted 3 pots of rosemary in my window box, their green needles smelling like clean hands and winter kitchens. When the light moved across the floor, it took the shape of the shawl for a minute, blue as a remembered word. I brewed tea, cut a square of lemon bar, and sat at my small table. Grief had not left. It had simply learned where to put its shoes. Anger had not vanished. It had changed into something usefully heavy, a weight that held the paper in place while I wrote thank you cards in careful script. I was not avenged. I was acknowledged. In the life I wanted, that was the difference that mattered. I sent one last message to the family thread, a photo of the memorial bookplate tucked into a mystery novel's front page. The caption read, "For anyone who wants to visit." I put the phone down. I opened my window to the thin air and let the rosemary scent lift across the room. I touched the cedar box once, then let it be. Some truths are meant to be referenced, not brandished. Some victories are a room you enter and do not announce. If my mother could see me now, she would nod and say, "Good." She would put on the shawl, sit by the window, and ask me to read her the first chapter again. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. And subscribe for more stories of quiet revenge.